Hi everyone, I'm Stacy Shoulder and I'm going to be teaching the writing workshop today, writing for audio and video specifically. Okay, so we have a bunch of slides and at the end of the workshop we have an exercise for you because the best way to learn how to write and to improve your writing is to do it. And writing for audio and video for television and radio is a little bit different than what you're used to. A couple things before you start writing that are important to think about. I want to do some basic research for your story. You need to know your story. You need to understand your story. And that might mean reading some wires, reading some articles, perhaps reading the study that the story is going to be based on, making some phone calls to people that will provide some information, some context, some background. Understanding why are we doing the story today? You want to know that. And what's new? What's most interesting? Those are questions that you want to be thinking about before you write. And then thinking about, are there different sides, right? If you're going to be covering a protest, you're going to be wanting to think about, well, if they're protesting against a business owner, then the business owner might be somebody that you're going to want to talk to as well and get his or her perspective. What video might you use to tell the story? If it's a video television story, and then if it's a radio story, is there sound? Is there an interview you need to get? Is there natural sound? Sound of a protest, sound of a concert, sound of the fire engines arriving at the scene. That natural sound can often help the viewer really feel like they're getting the story, being taken to the story. Another thing to think about, or where you are getting your information, is where you're getting information, the facts. And you really want to try to have at least 2 or 3 reliable sources for that information. You don't want to base your story on one single news report from a television station or from a newspaper, a news organization. So look for multiple sources. And then if you're writing about a study, try to seek out that study, okay? And not just look for summaries of the study or an analysis of the study. For broadcast, you need to think about writing concisely and conversationally. Short declarative sentences, 1 or 2 facts per sentence. Unlike print, where you might see a long sentence, a long compound sentence with lots of facts, certainly in the pyramid style that a lot of text stories are written. In broadcast, we don't do that. We want to avoid clauses, especially at the beginning of a sentence, because you want simple sentence structure, subject, verb. And then, of course, there's the mom rule that is in the Tuggle book that some journalism classes use. And the mom rule is how would you tell your mom this story? All right, that's a conversational way that you would tell your mom whatever the news story is that you're going to be writing. You want to use the active voice, not the passive voice, especially when you know who's doing the action. So if DPS has just gone and ended a house party on the row, you would want to say DPS officers broke up a house party on 28th Street versus a party was broken up on 28th Street by DPS. Okay, so you want to use the active voice. Okay, especially when you know who's doing the action. Again, compound sentences, cut them in 2, right? It's just easier to digest the information when you hear it in shorter sentences. Use specific fact-based descriptions. We want to avoid flowery, perhaps subjective adjectives. And then when you use time references, think about conversational ways of using time references. You would refer to yesterday as yesterday and not as whatever the day before is, if it was Sunday or Monday, all right? And then tomorrow as opposed to whatever the next day of the week is, all right? So be mindful of that in your writing. All right, lead sentence, arguably the most important sentence of your story. Use the newest, most interesting information first. Identify that key fact or 2 that you want to share with a viewer first. Does it answer the question, why should I care? All right, you want to make sure, in radio and television, people have an option to turn the station, to just go somewhere else quickly. So it's your one chance with that lead sentence to grab the viewer. So be mindful of what's the most up-to-date, most important, most significant, interesting fact that you want to place at the top of your story. When do you need to attribute? Okay, when the information in your story is based on another outlet's reporting. So if the LA Times does an investigative piece, we would want to attribute it to the LA Times. When the information comes from an official source, Dr. Susan Van Orman at the health center, it tells us that there are so many positive cases, for example, of COVID. We would want to let our viewers know where that information is coming from. If there's someone that we interview, for example, the president of American Airlines talking about, the number of passengers or how business is slowed down, we want to attribute to that person. And clearly, if we're doing a story that has a lot of perspectives and opinions, we want to make sure that we attribute those opinions to the people that they belong to. Okay, there's sometimes when we do not need to attribute, okay, when there's common knowledge, right? COVID-19 is a global pandemic. At this point, right, that's pretty common knowledge. Maybe last, February, March, it was new information. So at that point, we might have attributed it to the World Health Organization. Obvious facts, USC is located in South Los Angeles. There are certain facts that you can be pretty safe in knowing that it's a commonly known fact, all right? And then sometimes the information from the wires, from Associated Press that we use, or from CNS, City News Service, it's fine to use that information without attributing, all right? And then of course, if you talk to a witness, to an eyewitness, you would attribute it obviously to that person, but beyond that, it would just be that this person says he was at the scene and this is what he saw. Okay, so in broadcast, attribution goes first, always. We always want to let the listener, the viewer, know right away who is providing that information. We don't ever want to make it sound like it's coming from the anchor or the host of a radio show. All right, so we want to say that a DPS officer says so many students were in the building when the fire started, or if a Viterbi student has some comment about sleepy students, we want to say that's coming from a Viterbi professor. All right, writing to video. So before you write to video, you must view the video. Okay, that's very, very important. What kind of video do you have? Do you have the actual protest? Do you have our police at the protest? Are all those kinds of elements are things you want to identify. And then when you write your story, you can certainly reference some of those things, including the signs. There might be some interesting signs that you want to say what we might be seeing on some of those signs. All right. And then you want to try to avoid what I would call wallpaper or generic video. Sometimes the outside of a building doesn't do much for you as a viewer. All right. So be mindful of not just putting in shots that sort of have no meaning, that just could probably, have people, their eyes could glaze over when they look at that kind of video. Choosing sound bites is an interesting, editorial, the sound bites to express interesting facts, emotion, a certain expertise if we talk to a doctor or a firefighter. Obviously, there's certain drama in the stories that we cover. Partisanship, obviously, at this time, as we come to an election, partisanship is something that we're experiencing and hearing a lot of. So we want to make sure, though, that we have, the different sides, that we're not just favoring one side or the other of the aisle. Witness accounts are always interesting to hear because we want to provide that immediacy, that eyewitness account. And certainly different points of view are really important. Whenever we're doing a story, we want to be mindful of the different perspectives and from different types of people. All right, we are a very diverse community at USC. Los Angeles is a diverse community. So we want to make sure that the sound that we get reflects the diversity of our communities. So the sound bites, for the most part, we want to keep fairly concise. There's no magic number, but just enough to convey a fact, an idea, an opinion, an emotion. When you select your sound bites, you want to note what's the in cue, what are the first few words, and then what is the out cue? What are the last 3 words? So that you can, keep track of that, and that when you're ready to write your script and ready to edit your story, you're all set to go. And of course, you always want to make sure that the audio is understandable, right? It's clear. So writing into sound bites, we call them SOTs. That actually stands for sound on tape. SOTs are pretty much the lingo for TV. Actualities are often the verbiage for radio. You always want to set up the listener or viewer for what they're going to hear in a soundbite. Okay, so the soundbite should pick up where the script leaves off, but you don't want to repeat the soundbite. You don't want to say what the soundbite's going to say, and then we hear what the soundbite says. All right, so just make sure that you're trying to lead into it. All right, and usually for stories, both for radio and TV, we usually don't end on a soundbite. We usually have a line for the anchor or host that follows the soundbite. And here's an example. Here's a soundbite that we have from President Carol Folt. All right, I assure you we will meet these challenges. All right, so you see this whole soundbite. This is a moment of responsibility and opportunity, and we will seize them both. So how are we going to write into that? What's going to be our sentence that leads into this soundbite? Okay, so we might have something like this, very simple. USC President Carol Folt says she's prepared to lead the university through difficult times. All right, so we're not saying exactly what she says. We identify who it is that's going to be doing the talking, who's going to be in the soundbite, and we prepare our viewer for giving the viewer and listener the gist of what we're going to be talking about here. All right. So for audio, the speaker in the act is usually before the soundbite. Okay, so we identified Carol Folt. For video, it's important to introduce either the speaker by his or her name, if it's a well-known name, or by the type of person this is. So if it were a firefighter that we were introducing, we would introduce him or her just by saying a Los Angeles County firefighter told us, right, that this was a very difficult fire to fight. So that would be enough, just because the person's name wouldn't be as relevant because we don't know him or her by name. Okay, TV formats and terms, just a few things here. This goes beyond the writing, but just so you're familiar when you get an assignment to write a story. An intro is usually an anchor reading a story on camera. A copy story is usually an entire story on camera, not too long, okay, but an entire story might be 15, 20, 25 seconds at the most. You may have heard of a VO, which is a voiceover, which is when an anchor or reporter reads video as it plays. An ANCG is a full screen graphic. We might put up a full screen map where you'd write a few words to describe where the fires are located that you see on this map. A SOT, as we said, is sound on tape. This is when you have a soundbite, a person talking. Or it could be some natural sound up full, maybe for a few seconds, chants from a protest, music from a concert. A package is a self-contained story with track, video, and sound. Okay, and then the CG is the lower third name on the bottom of the screen, usually a place or a person. And then last is a tag, and this is at the very end of a story. A tag is basically the anchor reading something, a line or two at the end, sort of to button up a story. Some radio terms. An actuality, as we mentioned before, is basically similar to a soundbite in TV. It's a soundbite of a person. Cut and copy is a story that's read live by the host. A voicer is something that the reporter would track. So that's pre-recorded, just them, the reporter, tracking, talking that's recorded. A wrap is basically a wraparound or spot is an edited story with track and actuality. So it's a self-contained audio piece with both the reporter and perhaps some sound bites. And then the host intro is pretty much as it sounds, a live intro to a pre-edited piece. A pre-edited piece like a voicer or a rap. Okay, and then CG, we mentioned just a little bit. CGs are for television. These are, it's basically CG stands for Chiron generator. This goes way back in TV language. And every locator, every video should have a locator. Where is this? Is it Hollywood? Is it San Francisco? Is it New York City? All right, and every person should have a 2-line CG. First one, the top one being the name of the person, Clay Helton. The second line being his or her title. The title that is relevant to the story, okay? And reporters also need a CG. So if we have a reporter out doing a story, we want to make sure that his or her name and then Annenberg Media is the second line that we use for reporters. And this is just what a CG looks like for ATVN. Here's a woman, she's a protest organizer, and obviously we have a soundbite with her. All right, so that's basically, those are the basics for writing for video and audio. You should get a practice story to write. You'll have an instructor or me give you that story, and you'll have write an intro, your lead, right? We talked about the lead being super important. So the most important thing is to read through the story that you get, and then you're going to be asked to write basically your own version of that story after you figure out what's your lead, what are the important facts, and roughly if you have basically a 30-second story, that would probably be around maybe 5-6 sentences. And remember, you're going to write concisely and conversationally. All right, so that basically is the writing workshop for today. Thank you very much for joining for this workshop. And just know that writing only gets better when you practice it. So hope that you have a chance to do that.